He left me in a broken village, never knowing who lived next door. The old bus rattled as it climbed the cracked hill road, its windows fogged with breath and dust. Inside, Mara sat clutching a canvas bag that held her entire life, a folded blanket, 2 dresses, her mother's worn Bible, and a chipped cup she couldn't bear to throw away. The seat beneath her shook with every bump, but she didn't shift or complain. She kept her gaze steady on the road ahead, though she could barely see it through the streaked glass. The driver hummed to himself, his voice blending with the clattering of metal, and the air smelled faintly of diesel and rain. When the bus stopped at a narrow bend lined with dry grass and a lone tree, Mara knew this was where she was meant to get off. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. Her son, Daniel, stood waiting by the roadside, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He wore his city jacket, neat and too fine for this place, but he didn't look her in the eye. The silence stretched between them like something alive. Something they had both fed for years until it grew too large to ignore. "It's peaceful here," he said finally, his tone forced, as if that made it true. Mara looked past him, toward the cluster of old houses down the slope. Most were sagging, walls patched with tin and wood, roofs bowed under the weight of years. A dog barked somewhere far off, sharp and lonely. She nodded once. "Slow, peaceful," she echoed, though what she meant was empty. Daniel cleared his throat and adjusted his watch. He was always watching the time, as though love had a schedule. They walked the short path together, Daniel leading and Mara trailing behind. Her feet sank into the soft dirt, and the hem of her skirt caught the edges of thorns. At the bottom of the hill stood the house he had chosen for her. It leaned slightly to one side, plaster peeling in long curls. The windows were bare of curtains, and the door hung askew. The porch boards moaned under their weight as they stepped up. "I fixed what I could," Daniel said quickly, opening the door. Inside smelled of old wood and wet soil, but it was cleaner than she expected. A single chair sat near a small stove, a bed pushed against the far wall. "There's food," he added, pointing to a tin box on the shelf. "And water comes in the mornings from the pump." He turned then, his voice tightening. "It's just until I figure things out in the city. You know that." Mara said nothing. She walked slowly to the window and looked out. Across a narrow lane stood another house, sturdier than hers, with ivy creeping up its stone walls. Smoke drifted from its chimney, curling like a question into the gray sky. She could see movement inside, the shape of someone tending to the fire. Daniel followed her gaze. "Your neighbor," he said, shrugging. "Name's Ruth. I think, keeps to herself." He hesitated then, like a man standing on the edge of something deep. "You'll be fine, Ma." He reached out to touch her arm, but his hand stopped halfway, hovering in the air before falling back to his side. "You'll be fine," he said again, softer, as if repeating it could make it true. Then he stepped outside, his footsteps fading with the sound of the bus engine starting up again. The silence that followed was thick and full. Mara didn't move for a long time. She stood at the window, watching until the road swallowed the last trace of her son. Only then did she let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The air inside felt colder now. She went to the stove, touched the side of it, then opened the tin box he'd mentioned. Inside were 3 loaves of bread, some dried beans, and a small jar of oil. It was enough to last a few days if she was careful. She took a slice of bread, chewed it slowly, and stared at the flickering light from the neighbor's house. It felt strange, that quiet glow across the lane, almost like an eye watching. That night, the wind carried whispers through the cracks in the wall. The boards creaked and the shutters rattled, but Mara stayed awake, sitting on her bed and listening. Somewhere outside, a cat cried, long and low. She thought about her son, about how his eyes had flickered between guilt and impatience. She thought about the city he'd gone back to, the one filled with glass buildings and noise. Once, he'd promised to take her there. Once, he'd said no one would ever make her feel small again. Now she was here, in a place that looked forgotten by time, left to start over when there was barely any over left to start. Yet, even as she sat in the dim light, something inside her refused to break. It was a small thing, steady as the heartbeat under her ribs. In the morning, she rose before dawn. The pump outside groaned as she filled her bucket, her arms trembling from the effort. She washed her face with the cold water and stood in the yard, the sky just beginning to turn pale. Mist hung low over the grass, and she could smell wood smoke from across the lane. A figure appeared near the neighboring house, a tall woman with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She was carrying a bundle of firewood, her movements unhurried, but sure. When she noticed Mara, she stopped and nodded once. Mara nodded back. That was all. The woman turned and went inside, leaving the faint sound of her door closing. Later that day, Mara walked into the village proper, a slow 15-minute walk along a narrow road lined with wildflowers and broken fences. The few people she passed glanced her way but said nothing. Their faces were pale, worn by the same wind that had chipped the stones of their houses. She bought a few potatoes and salt from a small shop and returned home. The neighbor's door was open now, a pot of stew simmering on an outdoor fire. The smell drifted toward her: onions, garlic, and something rich beneath. It made her stomach tighten with hunger she didn't want to admit. She pretended not to notice, but as she walked past, the neighbor spoke. "You're new here," the woman said. Her voice was low, roughened by age but not unkind. Mara stopped. "I suppose I am," she said carefully. The woman stepped closer, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes were sharp, the kind that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. "Ruth," she said simply. "That's my name." Mara introduced herself, and they stood there in the mild wind for a few moments, silent except for the crackle of the fire. Then Ruth said, "You should eat. You look like someone who's forgotten what warm food tastes like." Before Mara could protest, Ruth handed her a bowl. The stew was thick, the broth deep and fragrant. Mara tasted it and closed her eyes for a moment. "Thank you," she whispered. That evening, Ruth came over with a lantern. She placed it on the table without asking and looked around the small room. "You'll need better light," she said. "Darkness here comes quicker than you think." She noticed the Bible on the shelf, the folded blanket, the empty chair. "Your boy left you here?" she asked, though she didn't make it sound cruel. Mara hesitated, then nodded. Ruth's expression didn't change, but her eyes softened in a way that surprised Mara. "Sometimes they leave because they think we can't see their shame," Ruth said, "but we always do." She adjusted the lantern wick and left without another word. Days passed like slow-moving clouds. Mara learned to fetch water, tend the small patch of garden behind the house, and patch the leaks in her roof. She saw Ruth often, sometimes sharing tea, sometimes just sitting quietly outside as the sun dipped low. The other villagers still kept their distance, but children sometimes came near, curious about the new woman who spoke softly and carried herself like someone who remembered better days. Then one afternoon, as Mara was sweeping her porch, a man in a dark coat arrived on horseback. He stopped by Ruth's gate and dismounted, his eyes darting across the lane. Mara recognized the look of authority even before he spoke. "Ruth," he called, his voice sharp. "You can't keep hiding." Ruth appeared in her doorway, calm as ever. "You've come far to say what everyone here already knows," she replied. The man's jaw tightened. "You were warned. Don't meddle with what isn't yours." He glanced toward Mara, and something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe concern. Ruth stepped forward, the light catching the silver strands in her hair. "She's not part of this," she said quietly. The man turned his horse around without another word and rode off, the echo of hooves fading down the road. Mara stood frozen, broom still in hand. When Ruth turned to her, there was something unreadable in her face. "Some debts," Ruth said softly, "are older than we are." That night, Mara couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the words, the tone of warning, the certainty in Ruth's voice. She looked out her window, and across the lane. Ruth's house was dark, no lantern, no movement. The air was still, but Mara felt something shift, like a current beneath the quiet. She sat by the stove, her hands clasped tight, and whispered to herself the same words she'd told her son countless times when he was small. "It will be all right." But for the first time, she wasn't sure she believed them. The next morning, the village felt different, as though the air had been combed in one direction during the night. The birds were quiet, their usual chatter replaced by a faint ringing stillness. Mara stepped outside with her bucket, the cold air biting against her skin. She looked across the lane. Ruth's door was closed, and no smoke rose from the chimney. The sight unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Ruth had lit her fire every morning since the day they met. Even when rain fell, that little plume of smoke always curled upward like a signal that life persisted. But now there was only stillness. Mara stood there for a long time, the bucket heavy in her hands, until she realized she was shivering. She forced herself to move toward the pump as she filled the bucket. She saw something by Ruth's gate, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. It was dark with dew and tied with a piece of twine. Mara glanced around, but no one was near. The village road was empty, the mist thick enough to blur the outlines of houses. She hesitated only a moment before walking over. Kneeling, she untied the twine and opened the cloth. Inside lay a loaf of bread, still soft, and a folded note written in a hand both neat and firm. "Keep this until I return," it read. If anyone asks, you don't know where I've gone. The words made her stomach twist. Return? From where? She looked toward the hills behind the houses, their tops swallowed in fog. Ruth's absence settled around her like a shadow. That day passed in slow motions. Mara cooked the bread with stew, trying to busy her hands so her mind wouldn't wander. She swept the floor twice, polished the cup that didn't need polishing, and recited old prayers until her voice cracked. The sound of the wind pressing against the shutters reminded her of whispers she couldn't quite catch. In the afternoon, she went to the shop, more for the sake of seeing people than buying anything. The shopkeeper, a small man with eyes like whetstones, looked up when she entered. "You're the one staying at the old Dower place," he said. Mara nodded. "And your neighbor Ruth." "Right. Haven't seen her today? Strange thing. She's not the kind to leave her fire cold." His tone carried curiosity wrapped in caution. Mara said only, "She left me a note." The man frowned. "A note? She said she'd return." Mara replied, "That's all." He leaned closer. "If I were you, I'd keep that to yourself. People here don't like questions, especially about her." When Mara stepped outside again, two older women sitting by the well lowered their voices as she passed. Their eyes followed her, sharp as the edges of glass. She pretended not to notice, but inside she felt something tighten, like the first tug of a storm wind. The village, she realized, had been holding its breath for a long time, waiting for something to move. Ruth's disappearance had shifted the weight of that silence onto Mara. By the time she reached her house, the sun had already begun to dip, throwing long shadows across the lane. The wind carried the smell of rain and distant earth. She sat by the window, the note in her lap, and read it again, her thumb tracing the last word. Return. That night, she dreamed of footsteps echoing through her house. They moved softly at first, then grew heavier, as if someone were walking in circles around her bed. When she opened her eyes, the darkness seemed thicker than usual. The air felt charged, alive with something unseen. She reached for the lantern Ruth had left her, struck a match, and held it close. The flame flickered wildly before steadying. The sound stopped. Only then did she realize she'd been holding her breath. She laughed quietly, trying to shake off the unease. "You're alone," she told herself. Just the wind, nothing more. But when she turned toward the door, she saw muddy footprints across the floorboards, small, bare, and leading from the window to her bed. She froze. The prints were fresh. Her hand trembled as she raised the lantern higher, following their path. They ended near the stove, where the floor dipped slightly. Nothing was there, no open window, no broken lock, no sign of anyone. Yet the footprints glistened faintly, as if still damp. Mara whispered a prayer under her breath, the same one her mother had taught her when she was a child afraid of storms. The flame steadied again, as though listening. Slowly, she wiped the prints away with a rag, each motion careful, deliberate. When she finished, she sat down, her heart beat loud in her ears. "You're tired," she told herself again. "That's all." Still, she kept the lantern burning until dawn. The following morning, she decided to visit the pastor. The church stood at the edge of the village, its bell tower leaning slightly, as if even faith had grown weary here. The path was muddy from the night's rain. As she walked, she passed the same women by the well. They looked away this time, their silence louder than words. Inside the church, the air smelled of wax and damp stone. Pastor Hensley, a tall man with thin hair and kind eyes, was lighting candles near the altar. "Mrs. Dower's old place, isn't it?" he said when she greeted him. "I remember it from years back. The roof leaked even then." Mara hesitated, then said softly, "I've been hearing things at night. And my neighbor Ruth, she's gone." The pastor's match paused halfway to another candle. "Ruth," he said slowly. "You mean Ruth Albright?" Mara nodded. "She said she'd return." Hensley looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. "Some stories don't stay buried, Miss Mara. Ruth was once the midwife here, helped half this village into the world. But after the fever took her family, she changed. People whispered she knew things no one should, herbs that healed faster than prayer, dreams that came true. They called her strange, and she stopped coming to church. Still, she's no harm. Never was." He sighed. "If she left, there's a reason. If you see her again, tell her she's welcome, though she may not believe it." On her way back, Mara turned those words over and over in her mind. Herbs that healed, dreams that came true. She thought of Ruth's sharp eyes, her calm voice, her way of speaking as if she'd already heard what you were about to say. The thought didn't frighten her, not exactly, but it stirred a strange curiosity. When she reached home, she noticed something new, a small wooden token nailed to her doorframe. It was carved roughly, in the shape of a circle crossed by two lines. She ran her fingers over it. The wood was warm despite the cold air. Someone must have placed it there while she was away. Across the lane, Ruth's door remained shut. That evening, Mara sat by the fire, the token resting in her palm. Its shape felt oddly familiar, though she couldn't recall why. When she turned it over, she noticed faint marks burned into the back, tiny letters she could barely read. WATCH. She traced them with her thumb, the word humming in her mind like an echo. That night, she set the token on the windowsill and kept the lantern lit again. Sleep came in fragments, filled with flashes of strange images. Ruth standing on a hill, holding something bright. Daniel as a boy, reaching out but never touching her. A door opening onto light that hurts a look at. She woke before dawn, heart racing. The lantern flame had burned out, yet the room wasn't entirely dark. A faint glow came from the token itself, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. The days that followed brought rain and rumor. People spoke of seeing lights in the forest at night, of hearing voices carried by the wind. The shopkeeper avoided meeting her eyes now, and the women by the well crossed themselves when she passed. Mara said nothing, but each night she placed the glowing token by her bed. It made her feel less alone, even if she didn't understand why. Then one afternoon, a knock came at her door, sharp, hurried. When she opened it, a young girl stood there, drenched from the rain. "You're the woman Ruth spoke of," the girl said breathlessly. "She said to give you this." She held out a folded cloth bundle. Inside was a small glass vial filled with dark liquid and a second note. "When the light falters, pour this on the ground," it read, "and do not be afraid." Mara tried to ask where Ruth was, but the girl only shook her head. She said she'd come when the wind turns. Then she ran off down the lane, bare feet splashing through puddles. Mara stood there for a long time, staring at the vial. The liquid inside shimmered faintly, not quite black, not quite blue. She placed it beside the token, both objects casting strange reflections in the lamplight. That night, thunder rolled across the sky, and the wind rose until the shutters banged against the walls. Mara wrapped herself in her blanket and listened. Between the gusts, she thought she heard a voice, faint, familiar. It whispered her name. At first, she thought it was a memory, but when she stepped to the window, she saw a figure standing by the pump. Even through the rain, she knew that shape, that calm posture. "Ruth." She rushed to the door, calling out, but when she stepped outside, the figure was gone. Only the pump handle moved, creaking back and forth, though no one touched it. The wind pressed hard against her, cold and wet, and she stumbled back inside, slamming the door. On the table, the vial rattled against the wood. The glow from the token flared bright, filling the room with a pale gold light that danced across the walls. The shadows around her seemed to shrink away. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the light dimmed, leaving only the sound of the rain. When morning came, the air smelled different, sharp, metallic. The lane was littered with branches, and the sky was the color of ash. But the strangest thing was Ruth's house. The door stood open, and smoke rose once again from the chimney. Mara felt her pulse quicken. She crossed the lane slowly, her shoes sinking into the wet earth. Inside, the house was warm, the fire burning low. Ruth sat at the table, her shawl draped over her shoulders, as though she had never left. "You kept the token," Ruth said without looking up. "Good. That's why you're still here." Mara opened her mouth, but no words came. Ruth lifted her gaze, and in the flicker of firelight, her eyes glimmered like water over stone. "They came looking for what I buried," she said, "but they won't find it now. Not while you're here." Mara stepped closer, her hands trembling. "What do you mean?" Ruth smiled faintly, a tired, knowing smile. "This village," she said, "was built on promises. Some kept, some broken, and every promise leaves a mark. You, Mara, were brought here because you still believe in keeping them." She reached out, placing her hand over Mara's. "Don't let fear make you forget who you are." Outside, the wind began to rise again, rattling the shutters. Ruth looked toward the window, her expression unreadable. "It's starting," she whispered. "When it ends, you'll understand." Mara wanted to ask what that meant, but the words caught in her throat. The wind roared, and the fire flared bright, throwing wild shadows across the walls. Ruth stood, her shawl lifting like wings in the draft. "Stay inside tonight," she said, "no matter what you hear." Then she stepped into the storm. The door slammed behind her, and the house shook. Mara ran to the window, but all she could see was the blur of rain, and the faint glimmer of something moving through it, something bright, like a spark carried by the wind. She pressed her palm to the glass and whispered Ruth's name. But the storm swallowed her voice whole. The storm raged through the night. fierce and unrelenting, as if the sky itself had cracked open. Rain lashed the windows, and thunder rolled through the valley in long, trembling waves. Mara sat by the fire, clutching the token in her palm until its edges bit into her skin. Every few moments, she thought she heard voices outside, some near, some carried from far away by the wind. They didn't sound human. The tones were too sharp, too layered, like many whispers speaking at once but never in unison. Each time she rose to check the window, lightning illuminated the lane, revealing nothing but swirling rain. The ruined houses across the hill vanished and reappeared in the flashes, their roofs gleaming wetly like bones under skin. Sometime after midnight, the noise changed. Beneath the wind, a low hum began, faint but steady, almost like singing. It came from across the lane from Ruth's house. Mara's first instinct was to stay inside, just as Ruth had told her. But curiosity and worry pulled at her like invisible hands. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, grabbed the lantern, and stepped outside. The rain had eased, but the ground was soft and slippery. The humming grew louder as she approached. It wasn't one voice but many, weaving together in strange, rising harmonies that made her chest ache. When she reached Ruth's gate, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the drip of water from the eaves. The door stood ajar, light flickering inside. Mara hesitated, then pushed it open. The fire still burned in the hearth, but the room felt empty. The warmth didn't reach her skin. It hovered, distant, as if belonging to someone else. Ruth's chair was overturned, her shawl lying crumpled beside it. The walls, usually lined with herbs and jars, were bare. Only one thing remained: a circle drawn on the floor in ash, crossed by two lines that mirrored the symbol on Mara's token. At its center sat the glass vial Ruth had given her, uncorked, its dark contents spilled into the cracks between the boards. The smell was sharp and earthy, like rain-soaked roots. Mara knelt, touching the edge of the circle. The ash was warm. Then, from somewhere beyond the back door, came a sound like branches snapping. She turned, heart pounding, and saw a figure through the rain-blurred window, a man in a dark coat. The same one who had come on horseback days ago. He moved slowly, each step deliberate. When she opened the door, he was already at the gate, his face pale in the faint light. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was calm, but there was urgency beneath it. "Where is Ruth?" Mara asked. The man's eyes flicked toward the house. "Gone," he said. "She's gone where she was meant to go. And you," he stopped, glancing at the mark on the doorframe behind her. "You've been chosen, haven't you?" The words made her step back instinctively. "Chosen for what?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "To finish what she began." Before she could reply, the wind rose again, swirling dust and leaves through the yard. The man turned sharply toward the woods. "They're coming," he muttered. "Stay inside. If you see the light again, don't look at it directly." He started to leave, but Mara caught his sleeve. "Tell me who you are." He hesitated, then said, "Someone who remembers. That's all." Then he was gone, swallowed by the trees. Mara stood in the rain, her mind spinning. She went back inside, shut the door, and leaned against it. The fire had died down to embers. The spilled liquid on the floor had dried to a faint shimmer, like glass dust. For the first time since her son left her here, she felt something close to fear, not of being alone, but of being seen. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat by the window, watching the dark ridge where the forest began. Once or twice, she saw faint lights moving between the trees, small and steady, as if carried by unseen hands. When dawn finally came, the sky was pale and heavy, the rain gone but leaving everything slick and shining. The village felt hushed again, the way it had the morning Ruth disappeared. Mara walked to the pump, filled her bucket, and caught sight of something new carved into the wood of her door: two letters, freshly etched, R.A. She brushed her fingers over them, a tremor passing through her. It could only mean Ruth was alive. Somewhere. Somehow. Later that morning, Daniel called. The phone, dusty from disuse, startled her when it rang. "Ma," his voice came through, clipped and hurried. "I'm sorry I haven't checked in sooner. Work's been..." She cut him off gently. "You're fine, Daniel. Don't worry." He hesitated. "I've been thinking of visiting. Maybe this weekend. You'd like that, right?" She looked out the window, at the lane, the wet grass, the empty gate. "Yes," she said softly. "I'd like that." But as she spoke, a strange unease stirred in her chest. The thought of him here, in this place that had changed her, didn't feel safe. "Just be careful on the road," she added. "The hills can be tricky after rain." He laughed lightly. "I'll manage, Ma. See you soon." When the call ended, she stood for a long time staring at the silent phone. Something about Ruth's words echoed in her mind. When it ends, you'll understand. That evening, she decided to clean Ruth's house, as if doing something ordinary might make the world make sense again. She swept the floors, scrubbed the table, and rehung the few herbs she found still drying by the window. Among them was a small pouch sewn shut with red thread. Inside was a folded piece of parchment covered in symbols she didn't recognize: circles, lines, and what looked like tiny suns. One symbol matched the mark on her door. At the bottom was a single phrase written in clear handwriting: "The one who stays keeps the light." She carried the parchment back to her house and set it beside the token. As dusk fell, a pale haze began to form outside, drifting across the lane like smoke. It wasn't mist, it moved against the wind, curling and twisting until it took on faint shapes that almost looked human. Mara stood frozen, watching from the window. One shape paused near her gate, head tilted as if listening. Then, softly, it spoke her name. She couldn't breathe. It was Daniel's voice. She opened the door before she realized what she was doing. The haze surged forward, but as it crossed the threshold, the token on her table flared with blinding light. The shape recoiled, twisting into itself before vanishing completely. Mara slammed the door shut and sank to the floor, shaking. "Not him," she whispered. "Not my boy." When morning came, she found footprints again, this time outside, leading from Ruth's gate to her own. They were deep, fresh, and bare. The sight filled her with both dread and determination. Whatever was happening here, she couldn't keep waiting for someone else to explain it. She took the token and the parchment and went toward the forest. The villagers watched her pass but didn't speak. At the edge of the woods, she found the man's horse tethered to a tree, but no sign of him. The path beyond was narrow, overgrown with vines. She followed it until the trees thickened and the air grew colder. There, in a small clearing, she saw stones arranged in a circle. At the center stood Ruth. She turned as Mara approached, a faint smile touching her lips. "You weren't meant to come yet," Ruth said, "but I knew you would." Her voice carried no surprise, only quiet certainty. "What is this?" Mara asked. "Why did you leave?" Ruth gestured toward the circle. "Because something old was waking. It stirs every few generations, drawn by regret, by promises unkept. The villagers call it a curse, but it's really a memory made alive. I thought I could keep it contained." She looked at Mara with something like sorrow. "But I needed someone who remembered love more than fear. That's why I called you here." Mara shook her head. "You didn't call me. Daniel left me." Ruth's eyes softened. "Do you think he chose this place by accident?" She stepped closer. "We are rarely where we are by choice. Sometimes we're placed." The words settled deep, unsettlingly true. Ruth reached out and pressed her palm to Mara's chest. "You have what I lost. That's why it listens to you." Before Mara could respond, the air within the stone circle began to shimmer, as if the light itself were bending. A low hum filled the clearing, growing louder. Shapes formed within the shimmer faces, dozens of them, blurred and shifting. Some looked human, others less so. They were whispering, their voices rising like wind through dry leaves. Ruth gripped Mara's hand. "They're drawn to pain," she said. "Yours, mine, theirs. If we don't anchor them, they'll feed on the whole valley." The hum turned to a roar, and the ground trembled. Mara felt something pull at her, cold and insistent, tugging at every regret she'd ever carried, every word unsaid, every goodbye too late. She thought of Daniel as a child, of her husband's funeral, of the years spent watching others leave. The weight of it almost crushed her, but then she remembered Ruth's words. Love more than fear. She clutched the token in her hand, holding it up toward the shimmering light. The glow brightened, spilling over her like fire and rain combined. The whispers grew frantic, pleading, then began to fade. One by one, the faces dissolved, leaving only the echo of their voices. When the light dimmed, Ruth was on her knees, breathing hard. "You did it," she said, her voice trembling. Mara looked around. The clearing was still. The air smelled clean, like rain after drought. "It's finished?" she asked. Ruth smiled weakly. "For now, but the endings here are only pauses." She reached into her shawl and pulled out a small worn photograph. It showed a young boy standing beside a woman who looked like Ruth, though younger, eyes full of light. "My son," she whispered. "He left too." Mara felt something break open in her chest. Without thinking, she reached out and took Ruth's hand. "Then maybe we both have something to mend." Ruth nodded, her expression both tired and at peace. They walked back toward the village in silence, the forest strangely bright around them. As they reached the lane, Mara saw Daniel's car parked by her house. He was standing by the door, looking uncertain, a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. When he saw her, his face lit up, relief flooding his eyes. "Ma," he called, his voice cracking. "I didn't think you'd be out walking." Mara smiled faintly, tears stinging her eyes. "I needed the air," she said. Daniel looked at Ruth curiously, then back at his mother. "Who's this?" he asked. Mara turned to introduce her, but Ruth was gone. Only the faint scent of rosemary lingered in the breeze. Daniel frowned. "You all right, Ma?" She nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "I think I am." But as she turned toward her door, she noticed something carved freshly into the wood beside a Tenu mark. This time in the shape of a heart, crossed by 2 lines. That night, the sky cleared, the stars sharp and countless. Mara sat by her window, watching the quiet village, the token resting warm in her palm. For the first time, she didn't feel abandoned. She felt anchored, seen, and strange as it was, chosen. Across the lane, Ruth's house was dark again, but in its window glimmered a faint light, as if someone had left a lantern burning just for her. The next morning dawned sharp and cold. The air washed clean after the storm. The village roofs glistened under a pale sun, and the lane between the houses shone like wet glass. Mara stood at her doorway, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, watching Daniel as he tried to light a cigarette with little success. His hands shook slightly, though he'd never admit it. "You shouldn't smoke here," she said. "The wind carries everything." He looked up, grinning sheepishly. "You sound like you've been living in a monastery, Ma." She smiled faintly. "Close enough." His laughter faded when he saw her expression. "You've changed," he said quietly. "You look stronger somehow." She tilted her head, unsure if that was a compliment or an observation. "Maybe I finally stopped waiting for someone to tell me what I am," she said. He didn't know how to answer that, so he just nodded. Inside, the house felt warmer than it had in weeks. Daniel busied himself fixing the loose latch on the window, a small attempt to feel useful. "You really like it here?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. "It's quiet," Mara said. "Peace has its own sound, once you learn to hear it." Daniel frowned. "I don't know how you do it. This place gives me the creeps. Everyone stares like I'm some outsider." She stirred the pot on the stove, letting the scent of herbs fill the air. "Maybe they see more than they say." He sighed, dropping his screwdriver onto the table. "I didn't mean to leave you here so long," he said suddenly. The words hung heavy between them. Mara didn't turn. "You did what you thought was right," she said softly. "We both did." He opened his mouth to reply, but then stopped, distracted by something outside. "Someone's at the gate." Mara wiped her hands and stepped to the window. A woman stood there, wrapped in a long brown coat, her face shadowed by the brim of her hat. She held a letter in one gloved hand. "Are you expecting mail?" Daniel asked. Mara shook her head. She opened the door and stepped outside. The woman smiled faintly, but her eyes were sharp and searching. "Mrs. Maralinto?" she asked. "Yes, this is for you." She handed over the letter and turned to leave. "Wait," Mara said. "Who sent this?" The woman paused, her expression unreadable. "Someone who said you'd understand." Then she walked away, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. Mara looked down at the envelope. Her name was written in Ruth's steady hand. She broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The words inside were simple, but they made her breath catch. "If you are reading this, the circle holds. What sleep is quiet now, but quiet things dream. Keep the token close. When the wind turns warm again, come to the hills. There is one more thing to see." Mara folded the letter carefully, her fingers trembling. Daniel watched her, concerned about clouding his face. "Who was that? What's going on?" She hesitated. "An old friend," she said finally. "She helped me understand this place." Daniel frowned but didn't push further. That night, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of pine and something faintly sweet, like wild honey. Mara couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the stars shimmer through the thin veil of clouds. The token lay on the table beside her, glowing faintly with its heartbeat pulse. When she closed her eyes, she could almost hear Ruth's voice again, calm, low, full of knowing. When the wind turns warm again, that meant soon. The air was already changing. Outside, the lane gleamed under the moonlight, and from across the way, Ruth's house looked softer now, less a ruin, more a shadow of something once alive. The following morning, Mara woke to find Daniel already outside, talking to the shopkeeper who'd come by with bread. Their voices carried through the open window. "It's good you came back for her," the shopkeeper said. "She's had odd company lately." Daniel's tone sharpened. "What kind of company?" The man hesitated. "Just strange folk passing through, asking about the old midwife, about Ruth Albright." Mara stepped outside before he could say more. "She was my neighbor," she said firmly. And she's not gone. The man blinked, startled, then nodded awkwardly. Of course, Mrs. Linton. Just talk, you know how villages are. He left quickly, muttering under his breath. Daniel looked at her. Ma, who's Ruth really? Mara met his eyes. Someone who kept her promises. That was all she said. Later that afternoon, Mara decided to go to the hills. Daniel protested, insisting it was too far, but she smiled and handed him her shawl. You'll need this more than I will. The path climbed steadily, winding between old stone walls and brambles that brushed against her skirt. The higher she went, the clearer the air felt. The village below seemed small now, almost peaceful. When she reached the ridge, she saw the circle again, the same ring of stones where she and Ruth had stood, but now the ground within shimmered faintly, as if sunlight had soaked into it and refused to leave. At the center stood a single object, Ruth's shawl, neatly folded, with a sprig of rosemary laid across it. Beneath the shawl was another note. Mara knelt and picked it up. For the one who stayed. That was all it said. But when she lifted the shawl, she saw something else beneath it, a small wooden box. Its surface carved with the same crossed heart symbol. She opened it carefully. Inside lay a pendant shaped like the token, only this one was made of metal, engraved with words too faint to read. As she held it, a warmth spread through her hand, climbing up her arm and into her chest. The wind rustled through the grass, and for a brief moment, she thought she heard Ruth's voice again, carrying on the breeze. Keep it safe, for what comes next. When Mara returned home, Daniel was pacing the porch. I was about to come looking for you, he said, half angry, half relieved. She smiled and handed him the shawl. I found something. She showed him the pendant. He turned it over in his hand. Looks old. What is it? A reminder, she said, that not everything forgotten stays that way. He studied her for a moment, then placed it back in her palm. You always speak in riddles now, he said, but there was no frustration in his voice, only quiet respect. She tucked the pendant beneath her blouse, feeling its weight settle against her heart. That evening, they sat together by the fire, eating in companionable silence. For the first time in years, the air between them felt easy. Daniel told her about his work, his small apartment, and the noise of the city. She listened, smiling, content just to hear his voice. Then, as the fire burned low, Daniel frowned. Do you hear that? He asked. Mara listened. At first, there was only the crackle of the logs. Then, faintly, a humming sound, distant, rhythmic, like wind passing through hollow stone. It grew louder, swelling and fading like the breath of something immense. It's the hills, she said quietly. They remember. That night, Mara dreamed again. In her dream, she was standing in the circle of stones, the pendant in her hand. Around her stood faces she couldn't name, some smiling, some watching silently. Ruth was among them, her shawl glowing faintly in the moonlight. You did well, Ruth said, but it's not over. One day, the circle will need to be drawn again, and someone must remember how. Mara looked down and saw that the token and the pendant had merged, forming a single shape that pulsed like a heartbeat. And if I forget? She asked. Ruth smiled. Then another will find the memory in you. The dream dissolved into light, and when Mara woke, the morning sun was streaming through the window. The pendant was warm against her chest. Days passed peacefully. The villagers grew kinder, greeting her as she walked to the shop or the pump. The women by the well smiled now instead of whispering. Children ran along the lane, laughing, their shadows chasing each other. It felt as though the weight that had hung over the village had finally lifted, but Mara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not with malice, but with curiosity, as if the land itself were paying attention. One evening, as the sky burned orange, she stood by the fence and whispered into the wind, "Thank you." Somewhere far off, a single bell chimed, and she knew her words had been heard. Daniel stayed for 2 weeks before returning to the city. In the morning he left. He hugged her tightly, his voice rough. "I'll come back soon," he promised. "You better," she said with a smile. As his car disappeared down the road, the lane fell silent again, but this time it was a comfortable silence. Mara turned toward the hills. She could see faint traces of mist rising there, curling gently like breath. The pendant felt heavy but warm against her skin. She went back inside, lit the lantern, and sat by the window, just as she had done on her first night here. The difference now was that she wasn't waiting for anyone. That night, as she prepared for bed, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find no one, only a single white feather lying on the step. It shimmered faintly in the moonlight. She picked it up, turned it over in her fingers, and smiled. "Good night, Ruth," she whispered. Closing the door, she placed the feather on her table beside the token, where it glowed faintly until morning. In the days that followed, the warmth in the air grew stronger, the hills turning green again. The villagers began rebuilding old houses, repairing roofs, and planting gardens. The broken village was no longer broken. It was waking up. Mara helped where she could, teaching children how to weave baskets, tending the communal garden. Her laughter became part of the soundscape of the place. Every evening, she would look toward Ruth's house and imagine her sitting by the fire, smiling quietly at how things had turned out. Sometimes, when the light hit just right, she could swear she saw a figure there only for a moment, then gone. And yet, beneath the peace, a faint vibration remained, a reminder that balance was never permanent. She could feel it sometimes at night, a heartbeat deep within the ground, slow but steady. It didn't frighten her. It simply told her that the world was still listening. The circle might rest, but it never truly slept. One afternoon, as she worked in her garden, a small boy ran up carrying something shiny. "Miss Mara," he shouted, "look what I found by the well." He handed her a coin-sized disc of metal engraved with the same symbol, 2 lines crossing a circle. "Keep it," she told him gently. "It's good luck." The boy grinned and ran off, the charm glinting in the sunlight. Mara watched him go, her smile tinged with quiet understanding. That night, she took out Ruth's letter again and read it by lamplight. The words seemed to shimmer differently now, as if new meanings had settled between the lines. "Quiet things dream." She whispered it aloud, the phrase carrying a weight she hadn't noticed before. Maybe that was what Ruth had meant all along. That piece itself was alive, dreaming, needing someone to tend it. Mara folded the letter and placed it under the lantern. The flame flickered once, twice, then steadied, casting a warm glow across the room. She sat back, hands folded in her lap, and felt something within her settle too. Outside, the night was still, the stars hung low, and the hills beyond the village pulsed faintly with unseen light. The broken village had healed, but not forgotten. It had simply learned to live with its memories, as Mara had. She looked once more toward Ruth's house, now dark and silent. "Sleep well," she whispered, and as she turned to close her window, a soft breeze brushed past her, carrying with it the faintest trace of rosemary. Months passed, and summer came to the valley like a shy guest invited at last. The broken houses gleamed with fresh paint, and the sound of hammering replaced the wind's old mournful tune. Children splashed in the creek, laughter echoing through the streets. And the village square came alive again with chatter, bread smells, and music from a rusty old radio that never stayed in tune. Mara had never imagined she'd live to see such warmth here. Her garden thrived in ways she couldn't explain, beans climbing high, flowers blooming in colors she didn't even remember planting. Some days she caught herself humming as she worked, forgetting for a moment that she had ever felt abandoned. The token still sat on her table, faintly warm, as if it breathed in rhythm with the land itself. Daniel called often now. His voice, once hurried and distant, carried patience she had never known in him. "You sound happy, Ma," he said one afternoon. "I think this place suits you." She smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Maybe it's because it asks nothing of me," she said, "only that I stay." He laughed. "That's rare for you." "What do you mean?" she asked. "You were always moving," he said. "Even when we had nowhere to go, you were planning the next thing." "You don't sound like that anymore." She thought about it after the call ended. He was right. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for something to happen. She was simply living, one quiet hour after another, like water settling into its shape. But peace, she was learning, was not the absence of weight. It was the acceptance of it. One evening, a storm rolled in from the hills, smaller than the one months before, but its voice felt familiar. The wind carried the smell of rosemary again, sharper this time. Mara stood at her window, watching the sky bruise purple. She knew before it came that this night would not pass quietly. As rain began to fall, she saw light in the distance, not lightning, but a steady, golden glow pulsing from the ridge, the circle of stones. The hills were calling. She put on her shawl, took the pendant from her neck, and stepped out into the rain. The path up the hill was slick, but her steps were sure. Every drop of rain felt cold, yet kind, like the touch of something that wanted her to remember. By the time she reached the ridge, the glow had grown stronger, pouring from the circle like liquid sunlight. The stones seemed alive, humming softly. She stood at the edge, water streaming down her face, and whispered, "Ruth." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air shimmered, and Ruth appeared within the circle, faint, transparent, but smiling as if no time had passed at all. "You came," Ruth said. Her voice was softer now, like a dream half remembered. You kept your promise. Mara swallowed hard, her throat tight. You knew I would. Ruth nodded. I couldn't hold it forever. The memory needs a new keeper now. Mara took a step closer. What happens if I take it? You already have, Ruth said gently. Every breath you've taken here, every kindness you've shown, every seed you've planted, they've all been part of the circle. The light pulsed brighter around them, casting long shadows that flickered and danced. This place will remember you, Ruth continued. When others come after, they'll feel what you've left. That's how peace survives, not through silence, but through echoes. Mara felt tears mingle with rain. Will I see you again? She asked. Ruth smiled, shaking her head slowly. I'm not leaving. I'm changing. The world keeps us in its own way. The glow deepened, turning the rain into drops of firelight. Ruth's form began to fade, but her voice lingered. Tell your son to forgive himself. That is his circle to close. Mara reached out, her fingers brushing light that felt both warm and impossibly far. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. No, Ruth said softly. Thank you, for remembering. Then the light folded inward, the hum sinking into the earth until all that remained was rain, the scent of rosemary, and the faint shimmer of the stones cooling in the dark. Mara stood there long after the glow faded, the pendant in her hand, its metal now etched with new lines, a heart, a circle, two crossing marks, and beneath them, a single word, keep dawn by dawn. The storm had passed. The air was clear again, sharp with the smell of wet grass. Mara walked home slowly, her body weary but her mind calm. The village was just waking, smoke curling from chimneys, roosters calling, someone laughing down the lane. When she reached her porch, she saw a small package waiting on the step. Inside was a photograph, recent but already worn around the edges. It showed Daniel in his apartment, holding up a mug and smiling, a note scrawled beneath, for your morning tea, coming next weekend, promise. She laughed softly, wiping rain from her eyes. Promises, she said aloud. All right. That week moved like sunlight through curtains. Slow, golden, gentle. Mara spent her days tending the garden, teaching children how to braid willow stems, and writing letters she'd never send. At night, she sometimes felt the pendant pulse faintly against her chest, a heartbeat in rhythm with her own. It was never frightening. It was simply there, like a breath. The villagers began calling her the keeper, half in jest, half in awe. When she laughed at the name, they told her she brought good luck. Crops were growing better, the well water clearer. Even the old clock tower, silent for years, began to chime again on windy nights. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, Daniel returned. His car rumbled down the road, dust trailing behind it, and when he stepped out, the first thing he said was, "It smells like home here." Mara smiled. It is home. He helped her carry a sack of flour inside, and as they sat down to tea, he noticed the pendant around her neck. That new? He asked. Old, she said. Older than both of us. He reached out, touching it lightly. Feels warm. It remembers, she replied. Everything worth remembering does. He didn't quite understand, but he nodded anyway. Later, as he unpacked his things, she caught him staring at the hills through the window, his expression thoughtful, the same curiosity she'd once felt, the same pull. That night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Mara sat alone by the fire. The room glowed softly, shadows swaying with the flames. She thought about the journey, how abandonment had turned to arrival, how despair had grown into something like grace. She thought of Ruth, of the circle, of the word carved into her pendant. Keep. The world was full of endings, she realized, but each ending had its keeper, someone willing to hold memory so others didn't have to. That was her purpose now, to keep, to tend, to remember. The sound of the fire filled the silence, steady and kind. She leaned back, closing her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you, neighbor." In the days that followed, small wonders continued. A tree that had long been dead began to bloom again behind her house, its branches heavy with white flowers. The villagers took it as a sign and gathered under it for their first midsummer festival in decades. Lanterns hung from the branches, their lights flickering like stars caught in leaves. Mara watched the children dance, their laughter ringing like bells. She stood beside Daniel, who looked at her with quiet pride. "You made this place live again," he said. She shook her head. "No," she said softly. "It always wanted to. I just listened." As the night deepened, music rose, fiddles, drums, voices carrying songs older than anyone could trace. The hills echoed with it, alive and bright. When the final song ended, a hush fell, gentle and full. Mara looked toward Ruth's house. In one of its windows, a single light flickered, faint but certain. She smiled. The crowd began to disperse, and Daniel turned to her. "You all right, Ma?" he asked. She nodded. "Better than all right." Together, they walked home under the moonlight. The air was warm, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of waiting for anything more. Everything she needed was already here. The land, the peace, the promise kept. That night, as she prepared for bed, she placed the pendant on her bedside table beside the token. The two glowed faintly in unison, their lights soft and pulsing. She whispered a small prayer of gratitude, not to any god she knew, but to the quiet forces that had carried her this far. "Let them rest," she said. "Let them dream." Outside, the wind answered, moving gently through the grass. The village slept soundly. The stars hung low over the hills, their reflection glimmering faintly in puddles left from the rain. Somewhere far off, an owl called once, twice, then fell silent. In the morning, Mara woke early. The world still wrapped in dawn's blue hush. She made tea, sat on the porch, and watched the mist roll down from the hills. The air felt different, lighter, easier, as if something immense had finally exhaled. The token's light had dimmed now, not gone but resting, its purpose fulfilled. She touched it fondly, whispering, "Sleep, little heart." When Daniel joined her, still sleepy, she handed him a cup. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She smiled. "How strange it is that peace can make you feel full instead of empty." He leaned against the post beside her. "Guess that's what home is," he said. "Something that fills the spaces you didn't know were hollow." She looked at him then, seeing the boy he'd been and the man he'd become, and nodded. "Exactly." As the sun climbed, the village came alive again. Roosters crowing, dogs barking, doors opening. The air buzzed with the sound of living. Mara rose from her chair and looked toward the distant ridge. The circle of stones was hidden from sight now, swallowed by the greenery. But she could still feel its pulse beneath the soil, deep and steady. She smiled one last time and whispered, "Keep the wind," lifted her words, carrying them across the fields and the roofs and the hills beyond. It brushed through the grass, rustled the trees, and touched the river, scattering her voice like seed. Somewhere, miles away, a traveler on the road felt that same wind and paused for a moment, sensing something gentle and unexplainable, a warmth that had no name but home. And the circle, buried deep beneath the earth, hummed softly once more, not in warning, but in song. The village of broken houses, once forgotten, had become a place that was remembered.